ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله صلى الله وسلم على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن اهتدى بهداه. أما بعد. Having spoken about a number of different topics, beginning with the concept of religiosity, practicing Islam, then moving on to discussions that relate to sects and sectarianism, and kufr and takfir. And last week first we discussed kufr and takfir, and last week we discussed sects and sectarianism. Today our discussion, inshallah ta'ala, is on the concept of bid'ah, the principle of bid'ah in Islam. What is the idea behind bid'ah? What is the proof, or what are the various evidences from the Quran and Sunnah that talk about the issue of bid'ah, and how we approach this issue. Now, this issue is an important issue. The concept of bid'ah, i.e. innovation, is a big point of discussion. And the reason it's a big point of discussion is that, firstly, the Prophet ﷺ emphasized on the harms and prohibition of innovation. Innovation is the standard translation for the word bid'ah. The plural for the word bid'ah is bid'ah, innovations. And before we start, there are a number of principles that I want to point your attention towards. First of all, and take this as a point of advice generally speaking, whenever discussing an issue, don't suffice with just touching, brushing over a point and then making it a matter of aqeedah for you. A lot of these discussions that we're having are highly controversial issues that have been discussed by scholars for 1400 years. How is it possible that someone thinks they can settle this issue by reading an article or listening to a dars or listening to a video? You know, to have proper understanding of an issue requires effort. It requires research, it requires energy, it requires time. And this topic of bid'ah, for example, some people might be under the impression it's a black and white issue. Black and white. Simple. Bid'ah, sunnah. This is a bid'ah, this is a sunnah. It's a black and white issue. It's not a black and white issue. It's not a black and white issue. There are areas which are black and white. And there are areas which are not black and white. And there are areas which are very, very intricate and difficult for any person to come to a conclusion to. This applies when talking about kufr and takfir. This applies when we're talking about bid'ah. And this also applies when we talk about the concept of imitating the disbelievers, tashabbuh, imitation generally. There are some things which are black and white and some things which are intricate. And one of the big imams of ijtihad in our ummah, who is Ibn Daqiq al-Eid rahimahullah ta'ala, one of the big imams of fiqh and hadith. He says regarding the issue of bid'ah, this is from the mushkilat. This is from the problematic issues, in which people have differed over a lot. He says, مَعَ كَوْنِهِ مِنَ الْمُشْكِلَاتِ الْقَوِيَّةِ. This is from the strong problematic issues, the issue of bid'ah. لعدم الضبط فيه بقوانين تقدم ذكرها للسابقين وقد تباين الناس في هذا الباب تباينا شديدا. And people have differed on this issue severely, vastly. Al-Shatibi says a similar thing. The Imam of the Malikiyyah, Al-Imam Shatibi, the Andalusi scholar, who wrote a number of important books like Al-I'tisam and Al-Muwafaqat, and he's considered from the authorities who paved the way for what became a new science, which is the science of maqasid al-sharia, the objectives of the sharia, even though it is more of a discussion within the discussion of usul al-fiqh. And this is why Shatibi's book, Al-Muwafaqat, is a book in usul al-fiqh really. But he discusses the issue of maqasid al-sharia, the objectives of sharia. What are the wider objectives and aims of Islam? A very important discussion. He also indicates towards the issue of bid'ah, innovation being a very difficult topic, and one in which people have been confused about. Therefore, whenever facing an issue, it's important to not be simplistic. Not important to be simplistic. Being simple is fine for ourselves. Being simple is fine for ourselves. You want a simple solution, simple answer, no problem. But that's enough for us as an individual, me as an individual. I act upon this simple principle. But when I want to speak, I want to discuss, I want to debate, I want to argue, I want to agree, I want to disagree, how can simplicity suffice? How can you agree, disagree, and you cannot tell me what are the ahadith that talk about the issue of bid'ah? How can you do it? This doesn't work. It really doesn't work. And when you think things are simplistic, what ends up happening is someone will pose evidences against you and you won't be able to respond. And something that you thought was a solid aqeedah that you're going to live and die upon, somebody will rip apart with one hadith. That's a big problem. And this is why, to begin with, we need to be willing to research, willing to put time and effort into something before we come to conclusions. That's what Allah wants from us, to ponder and think. So that's the first qa'idah number one. Principle number one is the issue of bid'ah requires research. It's not a black and white issue. What's innovation? Innovation is to introduce something new. It's to bring in something new. It has a linguistic meaning and it has a religious meaning. When it comes to the linguistic meaning, we're not too bothered. So if someone says drinking from plastic water bottles is a bid'ah, we say yes it is, no problem. Because that's a dunyawi type of bid'ah, we don't have a big issue. A bid'ah means something that did not exist before. قُلْ مَا كُنْتُ بِدْعًا مِنَ الرُّسُلِ. Say, I was not an innovation from the prophets. Meaning prophets came before me. The Prophet ﷺ, as Allah says in the Quran, prophets came before me, I'm not the first messenger to come. مَا كُنْتُ بِدْعًا مِنَ الرُّسُلِ. I'm not an innovation, a new thing. Allah sent prophets before me and I've also been sent as a prophet. So the word innovation, or the concept of innovation, has linguistic meaning, which we don't have a problem with. In fact, some innovations are obligatory when it comes to dunya. And this is why when some scholars say a bid'ah can be wajib or mustahab or mubah or makruh or haram, then usually they're referring to the more broad meaning of bid'ah, the more broad meaning of innovation. Why is the issue of bid'ah something frowned upon and discouraged in Islam? That's a question to you. Why is it such a big deal? Why is it not the case of, we just look at the issue, are you doing a good thing? If he's doing a good thing, khalas, don't make a big problem out of it. Don't cause a problem, bid'ah, not bid'ah, this is not a sunnah, this is a sunnah. If he's doing something good, he's doing something good, leave people alone. Why is the issue of bid'ah an important one?
Is it because it's emphasized in the khutbah?
Yeah, why do they emphasize it in the khutbah?
Why do they emphasize it?
Yeah, because the khatib is not a prophet. We can question the khatib as well. Huh? So?
I mean, there is a hadith, and there is one of the biggest hadith, the Imam Nawawi, the Muhammad Islam saying, whoever adds something in Islam, that will not be upset with it. Like someone like trying to help Islam, but I mean it's not part of Islam.
So the Sunnah, the Prophet ﷺ emphasized the innovations of misguidance. كُلُّ بِدْعَةٍ ضَلَالَةٍ. Every innovation is a misguidance. And he also said that innovations in Islam, in the religion, are rejected. Why? Why is it such a big thing?
Because it invalidates all your good deeds. You think you're doing good things, but you are not doing anything.
Right, so that's one issue. We don't have a proper guideline to decide what's a good action, what's not. Otherwise, It opens up the door. Anyone does what they want, and they argue this is a good thing. This is a good thing. And we'll discuss this issue. When we look at the difference of the scholars on the issue of bid'ah, we want to conclude by emphasizing this point. That opening the door of bid'ah opens up the door of big problems. Opens up the door of big problems. What's the implication when someone innovates in the religion?
As Muslims, the practice of the Prophet ﷺ is supposed to be a model,
Yes.
that we're supposed to follow.
No.
So if people go about doing whatever they want to do, it means we're deviating from the teachings
That
and
model.
the practices of the Prophet ﷺ.
Jameel, that's an important thing. We've been commanded to follow the prophets of Allah. Our prophet is Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He's the role model. He's the difference between truth and falsehood. The difference between guidance and misguidance. He has set a certain standard in the way we worship Allah. So going away from that standard indicates that we are leaving that perfect model and instead replacing it with something that can never be as good. So that's one problem. The other problem is that it is almost an accusation. We are almost saying that Islam needs this. That this is an extra thing that I'm adding to Islam. And Allah Ta'ala says, الْيَوْمَ أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينَكُمْ. Today I have completed for you your religion. The religion is complete. And this is why it's narrated from a number of the Salaf, including Malik and others, who said, whoever innovates into the religion has accused Muhammad of not delivering the message. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. فَمَا لَمْ يَكُنْ يَوْمَئِذٍ دِينًا لَا يَكُونُ الْيَوْمَ دِينًا. So what was not the deen then is not deen today. That's one issue with innovations. Secondly, opening, we touched upon this already, opening the door of innovation. You add something to Islam. Maybe you're doing it with a good intention, a new act of worship. Adding something to Islam opens up the door for anything to enter. Anything. So long as someone can justify this is a good thing, they have an excuse to do that thing. That's a big problem. That's a big problem. And we will not believe the type of things that people can introduce and make part of the religion. Thirdly, or fourthly, when you make something that's not part of the religion, what does this do? This causes an imbalance in the Sunnah, in our understanding of the Sunnah. The Messenger ﷺ left us on a path that is pure and good and beneficial, on guidance. Every time we add something that's not from it, we're weakening that thing. Is that not true? We're weakening it. And if you have a glass of milk and you put into it a drop of water, it's not the end of the world. But if you put in half a glass of water, it's not going to be very nice milk after that. And a full glass of water is going to destroy the whole thing. Every time you add something into something that's not from it, it's going to change that thing eventually. To the extent that which the Prophet ﷺ legislated and emphasized becomes forgotten. And things that the Prophet ﷺ never even taught us or talked about become the part of the deen. This is the deen. That's a big problem. That's a problem. Also, it's an extra burden on people. Every innovation is a burden on people. Because the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ are quite simple. What is recommended, what is the sunnah that we're required to follow, is quite simple. When you make so many additions to Islam, you're actually burdening people more. So you find people are doing so many difficult things, it's got nothing to do with Islam. Someone prays for me 100 rak'ahs, says subhanallah 100 times in that rak'ah, and that first rak'ah is 3 rak'ahs, and the next rak'ah is 3 rak'ahs, and the next rak'ah is 3 rak'ahs, and it takes him maybe 2-3 hours to pray one salah. Yeah, that's a big burden. And you could have done something that's much better, 2 rak'ahs, and is better than this 100 rak'ahs or 100 tasbihs or whatever it is. So introducing into the religion is a burden on people also. And the same is to be said about fabricated ahadith. As a number of our mashayikh say, the problem with circulating weak and fabricated ahadith, especially if they're very weak ahadith, is that it causes an imbalance in the sunnah. So that which is authentic is here, and we're constantly adding in fabrications. So now, in people's mind, this action is a huge action. Major sin. But there's nothing authentic to say it's a sin. And that which is actually sinful, and which is actually severely prohibited, people don't pay much attention to, because the fabricated hadith have overwhelmed that type of thing. This is why sticking to the clear sunnah is a barakah, is a blessing. The other thing is, the issue of innovation is restricted to matters of worship. And this is a very important principle. Because the Prophet ﷺ says, "Man ahdatha," whoever innovates, "fi amrina hadha," in this matter of ours, this religion of ours. "Man ahdatha fi amrina hadha, ma laysa minhu," what is not part of it. And this statement is a big statement which we're going to discuss in a minute. "Ma laysa minhu," what is not part of it, فَهُوَ رَدٌّ, then it's rejected. It's returned back to him, rejected. So he said what? Whoever innovates something into this affair, this religion. This religion. So anything that is not an act of worship, a religious act of worship, does not come under the discussion of bid'ah. For example, is it possible for wearing jeans to be a bid'ah? No, why not?
So don't be covering your aura.
Even if they don't cover the awra. Wearing shorts that uncover the thighs, can that be a bid'ah? From a religious perspective? No? Why not? What did we just say now? It has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with acts of worship.
Yeah.
When someone wears jeans, or even shorts, they're not doing it as an act of worship. It's never intended as an act of worship. And therefore, we don't have a problem with jeans or shorts because they're a bid'ah. We might have a problem for another reason. Because they don't cover the awra, for instance, or another problem. Maybe. But the issue of innovation can never come into the discussion in the first place, because this is not an act of worship. It's not an act of worship in the first place. The same is to be said about wearing a suit. Having a certain haircut, growing an afro, like some of you do. Can the discussion on bid'ah come into growing an afro? Yes or no? No, because it's unrelated to the religion. Unrelated to the religion. Can making dua in congregation after salah, can that come into the discussion of bid'ah? Yes. I'm not saying it's a bid'ah, I'm saying it can come into the discussion. Can celebrating the Mawlid of the Prophet ﷺ come into the discussion of bid'ah? It can come into the discussion. Again, whether it is or not is a discussion. That's the discussion to have. But we now just want to know, can this come into the discussion in the first place or not? Because what we will find sometimes is people ruling something to be a bid'ah which has got nothing to do with bid'ah in the first place. If you have a problem with it, prove it in a different way. It is haram, it is sinful, it is harmful, it is whatever. But bid'ah is not relevant to it. So that's the first step. We distinguish between aadat and ibadat. Aadat, which is dunyawi type of issues, customs, customary practices, and between acts of worship. People celebrating their weddings in a particular way. A woman wears a white dress, the man wears a black suit, the man and the woman put rings into each other's fingers, they cut a cake together, they feed each other from the cake, and so on and so forth. Does it come into the discussion of bid'ah? No. It doesn't come into the discussion of bid'ah because it's unrelated to the religion in terms of as an act of worship. It is not practiced as a part of the religion. If someone says it used to be practiced as part of a religion 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, we say no problem. It used to, the ruling then applies then. Today we look at what it represents today. So therefore, we say that wearing wedding rings is permissible, mubah. It can't be prohibited from the perspective of bid'ah. Because even though some people might argue it was worn at one point in time to sort of indicate good luck and maybe this this ring indicates that this marriage remains so long as we keep wearing our ring, and if you take off the ring, a problem's going to happen. Okay, those types of superstitions and beliefs, etc., if they existed at one point, no problem. We look at what it represents today. Today it represents a purely customary practice, cultural practice. And so therefore we say the discussion of bid'ah doesn't come into it. Different discussion? Maybe. Different discussion come into it? Maybe. We'll discuss that. But bid'ah? No.
In that case, the Christmas tree, it became a custom at the moment. It's not a religious matter anymore. So if a Muslim is having a Christmas tree in their house,
No.
would that...
طبعا something becoming a custom or becoming a religious practice, that can change over time. It can change over time. When it comes to the discussion on Christmas, the discussion on Christmas has definitely not lost all attachments to religious practice. It's not lost. And this is why Christians go to church, either on Christmas or around Christmas and so on and so forth. And the religious association is still there. The fact that it's become a big marketing opportunity, a business opportunity, etc., doesn't mean that it's lost its religious attachment. Us as well for Eid. Eid has lost a lot of its religious attitude. It's become a day of partying, messing about, buying stuff, eating, overeating, and so on and so forth. Do we say that Eid is no longer a religious practice? We say it's a religious practice, because it's still strongly connected to this issue. There's no comparison between Eid and Christmas, of course, because the religious practice on Eid is still the main thing. The Eid prayer, for example, is the main thing. The Udhiyah is the main thing. And then it has other additions as well. Unlike Christmas, where it has lost a lot of its religious implications. But still that religious implications remain there. So it's not sufficient to say it's a custom. In 500 years' time, or 200 years' time, if the Christmas tree becomes unrelated, now it is difficult for us to accept, because we still see the strong religious association. But in 200 years' time, that might be easy to accept. Maybe no one even knows, this tree, they used to do it for this reason. They used to have Christmas tree because of this. They might not realize that in 200 years' time. In 200 years' time, we'll have scholars that can resolve the problems at that time. So, yes, it's true to some extent, but not sufficient to say it's a customary thing. Therefore, Muslims can, have Christmas trees in their homes during Christmas. So that's a key rule, that we look at this issue. Is it a religious thing, an act of worship? Is it done with the intention of ta'abbud? Is it done with the intention of it being an act of worship to come closer to Allah? If that intention is there, it comes into the discussion of bid'ah. Could be a bid'ah, it could not be a bid'ah. It depends on some of the principles that we'll look at, inshallah. Another important thing is that innovations in the usul of belief, in the usul of our beliefs, are much more dangerous and much more severe, and should be much more emphasized than innovations in furu'a, practices, small acts of worship. So when we say this is a person of bid'ah, we should not be using that type of term for issues of fiqh issues, furu'i issues. That term should only be used for major issues. Someone who rejects qadar, we say that's a major bid'ah. Anyone who rejects qadar is a mubtadi'. Someone who curses the Sahaba, that's not a small issue, because the Sahaba are the transmitters of the Quran and the Deen. So when someone curses Abu Bakr and Umar, we don't take that lightly. That's a major innovation in the religion, because they curse thinking that they're coming closer to Allah Ta'ala by cursing.
Would these issues also be kufr now?
They may come into kufr also. They may come into kufr. And the scholars disagree on the one who curses Abu Bakr and Umar. Do they leave the fold of Islam or not? Do they leave the fold of Islam or not? That's a discussion between the scholars. And so the discussion on kufr can even come into that. Same with the issue of qadar, the discussion of kufr can come into that. And so, when we talk about innovations, we need to focus on serious, major innovations, more so than secondary things. More so than secondary things. Someone makes dhikr in a circle in one voice. Everyone says subhanallah, subhanallah, subhanallah together in one voice. When we talk about innovations, we're not talking about that type of thing. Whether that's an innovation or not can be discussed as a fiqhi matter, no problem. It can be discussed. But when we say he's a person of innovation, we can't be referring to someone who does this type of thing. These are not considered major innovations in Islam. And we'll see in a moment why these are matters of ijtihad between the scholars in the first place. So when we talk about innovations, we should worry about things like what? Like liberalism and secularism and various other innovative beliefs that have influenced Islam today. The innovation of rejecting the Sunnah and saying the Quran is enough, we don't need a hadith. These are major, major innovations. And you have someone busying themselves with another person because he's reading Qasida Burda or he's reading Shama'il of the Tirmidhi on the Mawlid, and he's ignoring someone who rejects the Sunnah. Occupy yourself with that. Someone's rejecting the Sunnah and writing books and articles on why the Sunnah isn't an authority, and you're busy about someone. Let them do what they want to do. This is more of a priority. So these things have to be distinguished. That doesn't mean that these things are also not points of discussion. They're points of discussion also, academically. Not based on sectarianism. My group says this, his group says that, let's attack. Based on academic understanding, no problem. But should you focus on this or what's more important? Focus on what's more important, that's common sense. The other principle is that the opinion of a scholar does not make something a sunnah. The opinion of a scholar gives us a reason to excuse someone else, but it does not give us a reason to say that this practice is definitely a sunnah. Maybe a scholar holds an opinion and it's a bid'ah. No problem. Maybe a scholar holds an opinion and that opinion is a bid'ah. In fact, sometimes a scholar can hold an opinion and that opinion is completely batil, false. Because the scholars are also human beings. But what do we benefit from difference of opinion? We benefit in excusing other people. Excusing other people. طيب. The fact that Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and Jalaluddin al-Suyuti and Ibn al-Jazari and a number of the scholars allow, for example, celebration of the Mawlid of the Prophet ﷺ. These scholars allow celebration of the Mawlid of the Prophet ﷺ with certain conditions. Are these guys scholars or not? Respectable scholars or beginner scholars? Respectable scholars. All of them allow the Mawlid of the Prophet ﷺ. Does that make the Mawlid a Sunnah? No. But what does it help us? Where does it help us? It helps us in giving people an excuse. It helps us in saying, okay, these people, and you may be there of the position that on a certain day in the year they want to do something, recite the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, recite a book of hadith, they want to sing some anashid about the Prophet ﷺ, etc. If they're doing it within reasonable boundaries, we have an excuse for them. That excuse is that they're following someone more knowledgeable than you and me. That's an excuse. Like, is it enough of a reason to say it is a sunnah? No. No one says the Mawlid is a sunnah. No one can say the Mawlid is a sunnah. Like, the discussion is it permissible or not in the first place? Just because some scholars say it's permissible, it doesn't mean that necessarily the action is permissible, because those scholars might be mistaken. But what should it do for us? It should teach us to give people an excuse. Because at the end of the day, when you say to him, this scholar says it's haram, he can return and say, yeah, but this scholar says it's allowed. So why should he have to follow the scholar that I'm indicating towards and leave the scholar that he wants to follow, even though he is following a trustworthy scholar? And we all agree that these are trustworthy scholars. So the position of a scholar does not make something halal, and it doesn't make something a sunnah, and it could still be a bid'ah, but it gives us a reason to give people excuses. especially in the time that we're living in today. We want to give people as much excuse as possible on these types of things, so that we can emphasize more on what's more harmful to Islam, like some of the major innovations that I've discussed with you now. And you all know the long and vast discussions that take place every year in Rabi' al-Awwal. Alhamdulillah ala kulli hal. So that's an important qa'idah, that's another principle, and that's the statement of the scholar. Doesn't make something a sunnah, but it helps in giving us excuses. Do we want to give people excuse, or we don't want to give people excuse? Is it a good thing to excuse people? Alhamdulillah. Islam teaches that, yeah? Taban, Islam teaches us to excuse people and find as many excuses for them as possible. We don't want to trap people. We don't want to trap people where we're looking out to find anything possible to catch them up. No, we want to do the opposite. Look for anything possible to give them an excuse, so long as we're not talking about clear things. Another principle is that the bid'ah that all the scholars agree is an evil innovation is that innovation which clashes with the sunnah, contradicts. There is a big difference between something that is not narrated in the sunnah and between something that contradicts the sunnah. This is a very important distinction. Al-Hafidh ibn Rajab, as well as Ibn Jawzi before him, and most of the scholars really who have spoken about defining bid'ah, make innovations those things that clash with the deen, not those things that have not been explicitly reported in the deen. And this is a mistake of a lot of people. And this is a bad mistake. The reason it's a bad mistake is because a lot of people are under the impression that if there is no authentic hadith proving something explicitly, that exact thing, if there isn't that action becomes a bid'ah straight away, and it becomes haram, because the principle is that every bid'ah is haram. Two problematic principles. Why is this a problem? Because you will end up making the practice of the Sahaba a bid'ah, and you have no way of getting out of that, because the companions have done things which we have no authentic ahadith for. So when you make this your principle, you're going to end up making a lot of practices of the Sahaba an innovation. And I've heard some people who uphold this principle say that with confidence. Abu Hurairah says this even though it is a bid'ah. You can't say a statement like that. Abu Hurairah lived with the Prophet ﷺ. You came 20 generations after the Prophet ﷺ. This is a man who lived with the Messenger ﷺ, lived with him. What more of a sunnah do you want than that? Anything closer to the sunnah than that? To be living with the Prophet and spreading his teachings? And someone has the nerves to say it's a bid'ah even though Abu Hurairah does it? Even if you disagree, you say Abu Hurairah held this opinion, but other scholars or other Sahaba disagreed with Abu Hurairah, and the position of the majority of companions is more preferred. No problem, because the Sahaba are also not prophets. A mistake can happen. But the word bid'ah is a big statement. Imam Ahmad rahimahullah says al-bid'atu shadida. Bid'ah is shadid. It's a big thing. It's not something that we can use so easily. And someone says to me, this is a bid'ah even though Umar ibn Khattab did. MashaAllah. After that, what's left then of following the Salaf and following the Sahaba and following the Khulafa? Therefore, this principle is a principle which is going to cause problems, because it makes things the Sahaba did innovations. So that's another important principle. So what exactly comes under bid'ah? As we said in the beginning, it's a grey area for some things. But what we know for sure, that which contradicts is a bid'ah. That which contradicts is a bid'ah. For example, someone adds an obligatory salah. Someone adds rak'ahs to the salah. Someone does something which the sunnah explicitly doesn't allow. And so on. Here we say this is a bid'ah. because you have clashed with the Sunnah. You can't justify and say, but the Sunnah indicates that this is okay. You can't, because it's a clash, contradiction. It's a contradiction. You make ghusl for every salah, for example. You make ghusl for every salah. That's problematic. Because the Sunnah is one thing. As well as the issue of this being takalluf, added, exerting additional effort. You make, like we said, additional salah or an additional rak'ah. That's a clash with the Sunnah. So, clashing with the Sunnah is a clear bid'ah. Where there's no clash, this is where the discussion is. Where is there no clash? For example, you say, every time I finish a dars like this, I'm going to pray 2 rak'ahs. Do we have a Sunnah to prohibit that? No. Do we have a Sunnah to affirm and say this is a Sunnah? Right. Is it possible to fit it under the general recommendations of Salah? It's possible. Someone could turn around and say, the Sunnah has recommended Salah, generally speaking. The Sunnah has recommended Salah. Bid'ah Hasana is a term that some scholars use, yes. Bid'ah Hasana is a term some scholars use. Like, it's not really a good term in reality. And we'll discuss in a moment the reason for it. This would be a bid'ah hasana. This would be bid'ah hasana. Does Islam teach us dua? Does it teach us to raise our hands when making dua? No. Well, raising the hands is mustahab in some places. So, if after every dars we raise our hands and make dua, is it a clash with the Sunnah? Does it clash with the Sunnah? It doesn't clash. It doesn't clash, because the Sunnah didn't prohibit this. So it's in that circle of discussion. And it might be something that the scholars would refer to, or some scholars, as bid'ah hasan. And this is a widely practiced thing by the scholars. A lot of them, after dars, make dua in congregation.
Shaykh, what about the practice of gatherings on set days after somebody's death? Would make a collective dua?
Gathering on set days?
Yeah, after somebody's death.
No. It would come under the discussion also. It would come under the discussion. See, when we say it comes under the discussion, it doesn't mean we say it's permissible or it's not an innovation. We're just saying that, is there a direct clash? Is there a direct clash? Because the one who does that, who says, after 1 week of the death of this person, all of us are going to come into the masjid. All of us are going to come into the masjid, and we're going to make dua for the individual. Or we're all going to read Quran, and with the intention of passing on that reward for this individual. He will argue that this has a basis in the Sharia. He will argue that. So it's part of this discussion, because it's not a direct clash.
Would there be an argument for that if somebody saying this has become so customary now that it's a burden on the people because they also feel it?
That's right.
Would that be taken into consideration when
It wouldn't just be taken into consideration, it would be a more than valid argument. And this is why we say, even though some scholars, or scholars generally, disagree on what exactly constitutes an innovation, even though that's the case, and even though there is an excuse for people a lot of the time for doing certain practices, we say opening the door of bid'ah is a door that doesn't close. That's the problem. When you open up the door a small period, a little bit, it doesn't close. I said to some of the brothers who support the celebrating of the Mawlid of the Prophet ﷺ, and I don't make a big issue out of it, but I said to him, if you accept that celebrating the Mawlid of the Prophet is recommended, you have no choice but to accept that Christmas is recommended. No choice. Because this principle goes with that principle. You're celebrating the Prophet, here we're celebrating the Prophet also. And it was a back and forth, a discussion. He wasn't happy with that claim. But the point is that when you open up the door doesn't close. And this is where we have a problem. So when someone says to me, we're going to use musical instruments for the adhan, make adhan, and this happens by the way, I'm not making this up, this happens. Yeah, and I've seen this happen. I've seen it happen. Musical instruments during adhan. Adhan is made and musical instruments are. Why? Because the adhan is there to sound beautiful and to call people to prayer, etc. These musical instruments are just a means to make it more beautiful. So this is the issue. This is the issue. We have a door that won't close. We have a door that won't close, and the religion becomes something very different to what they knew. Imagine Anas ibn Malik in that time. Anas ibn Malik says, everything that you do today, I don't recognize it. Meaning, everything that you do today, none of it is in accordance with what we used to do at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Except Salah. And he said, even this Salah you've added into things, what you've added. Imagine, at the time of Anas, he's still alive, a companion's still alive, and he's saying, you guys have come up with so much rubbish, I can barely recognize anything that you do if I compare it to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The only thing that I recognize is Salah. And even this Salah, you've أحدثتم فيه ما قد أحدثتم. And this is why opening that door is what this problem causes. Like we said, these principles are useful. These principles are useful to understand other people's perspective. Where is he coming from? And it helps me to know how critical should I be. And what should I focus on when criticizing? Do I focus on this or focus on that? As we said, we should never be lenient on using the word bid'ah unless we have clear knowledge. We should never be lenient. Someone said to Imam Ahmad rahimahullah, he said to him, some people say Abu Bakr, then Umar, then Ali, then Uthman. What do you say about that? Meaning, Abu Bakr is the best of Sahaba, then Umar, then Ali, then Uthman. He said, what do you say about that? قال ما يعجبني هذا القول. He said, I don't like this statement. قال هل نقول هو مبتدع? Do we say he's an innovator? قال لا. He said, no. البدعة شديدة. He said, I don't say he's an innovator. Because bid'ah is strong. It's a big thing. You can't use it so lightly. And a lot of the issues that people have accused others for innovating, a lot of those issues are things practiced by the Salaf. This is why we have to be careful when accusing someone or something of being innovation. Because if you're not 100% certain, you could well be accusing a companion or a tabi'i or some of the imams of the Salaf of being innovators. That's a big statement. As Imam Ahmad, remember this statement, al-bid'atu shadida. What we said in takfir, we say the same about tabdi'. We don't have a responsibility of calling other people innovators. We don't have a responsibility. Some things are clear, like we've just discussed. Hating the Sahaba, rejecting the Sunnah, these types of things. These things are clear. There's no need to discuss. But then there are other discussions. We don't have to rush to calling those things innovations or people innovators. Instead, we discuss things with hujjah. You have hujjah, jazakallah khair. Use that proof, and we have a discussion point. We also have to distinguish between something that's a bid'ah and that person who does it being an innovator. Something might be disbelief, but he doesn't become a disbeliever, like we said. And this is why Imam Ahmad said to a number of people, if I said what you say, I would have disbelieved. If I said what you said, I would have become a disbeliever. Why? Because if I said what you said, I know what I'm talking about. I know the implication of this statement. So therefore I would have fallen into kufr. But you, because you're ignorant, I don't say you've fallen into kufr. Same with innovation. Something might be a bid'ah, but the person who does it doesn't have to be an innovator. So when you see a scholar calling something a bid'ah, which another scholar does, you say no problem. It's not the end of the world. That scholar has an ijtihad. In fact, you'll be amazed that Imam Ahmad called some things a bid'ah, which we today accept widely. Like the books of fiqh, Imam Ahmad called it a bid'ah. And now our study is all from the books of fiqh. Imam Ahmad called the books of fiqh a bid'ah. He says Abu Hanifa comes and puts a book for us, and Muhammad comes and puts a book for us, and Abu Yusuf comes, then Malik and Awza'i come and put. Every time someone comes, he puts down a book for us with his own views and his own opinions. قال كلها بدعة. All of it is a bid'ah. Imagine something that some big scholars do. He says كلها بدعة. We say no problem. We say no problem. Imam Ahmad, if he's critical of something, we don't have to collapse and lose hope and say the world has ended because other scholars disagree. So there's a difference between someone calling something an innovation and some scholars said saying Bismillah before making wudu is a bid'ah. Saying Bismillah before making wudu is a bid'ah. And this is one of the opinions attributed to Malik ibn Anas, rahimahullah. And some scholars say it's wajib. Like Ishaq ibn al-Hawi. And it's the mashhur mu'tamad position of the Hanabila. Saying Bismillah is wajib. And someone else comes and says it's a bid'ah. Say no problem, no problem, because these are ijtihadi matters. Imam Ahmad would not say Malik is an innovator, and Malik wouldn't say someone like Ahmad is an innovator. So we distinguish between that which is potentially an innovation and that which someone becomes an innovator due to. طبعا Shaykh Nasir al-Din al-Albani rahimahullah, he has some good discussions. طبعا Shaykh Nasir's classes on YouTube they're not really classes, they're discussions. It's like they're having a discussion over tea and coffee. But they're very beneficial. He discusses a lot of issues and so on. One of the things he discusses this issue of, this discussion of bid'ah. Focus, boys, eh? Boys, you should focus. I know you're bored and it's a heavy topic, but even just trying to listen will be good for you, inshallah. And in 20 years' time you'll be here giving classes, and then people will be talking over your classes as well. Inshallah, of course. I'm not making dua to say I hope people talk over your classes. I'm just saying that. So, he has some discussions on this issue of bid'ah, and he emphasizes this point. He emphasizes the point that something might be an innovation in my opinion, but what you do, I don't say you're an innovator. Because I understand you have an ijtihad. I understand you do this for a reason. You have an argument. And he delves into this issue a lot. And one of the things he mentions is that you only refer to someone as an innovator إِذَا غَلَبَ عَلَيْهِ. This is a beautiful qaida. If something becomes overwhelming in a person, غَلَبَ عَلَيْهِ. Not if someone does 1, 2, 3, 4 things that you believe are an innovation, you say he's an innovator. No. Some scholars went wrong with this. Where they said if you do one thing that's an innovation, you become an innovator. Allahu Akbar. No one will be safe then. No one will be safe. Because our ijtihad will always differ. So this is why, this is a useful qa'idah the Shaykh mentioned, rahimahullah, which is that إِذَا غَلَبَ عَلَيْهِ, meaning innovations become a thing, part of him in terms of he's constantly in that. Or he's falling into major innovations. Here that type of label is befitting and appropriate, but not when it's a couple of issues which he's mistaken on and he has ijtihad. طيب. I've realized this discussion is much longer than I expected. Another important principle is that not every innovation, which might be an innovation, is ruled to be haram. And this is something that the fuqaha of the four madhahib are agreed upon. That not everything which is ruled to be a bid'ah becomes haram straight away. And you'll find in the books of the Hanbali scholars and the Hanafiya and others, they will say that this is makruh, لِأَنَّهُ لَمْ يَرِدْ. This doing things is disliked, because it's not reported in the Sunnah. Or this type of thing is makruh, and I fear that he's innovating. I fear that it's an innovation. So, whether a bid'ah is haram or makruh will depend on the severity of that innovation. How can we distinguish between an innovation which is prohibited or disliked? We can't easily distinguish. It requires ijtihad. But an innovation which completely clashes with the Sunnah is closer to being haram. And an innovation which comes under some of the principles of the Sunnah, but is not reported really, if we rule it to be a bid'ah, we're going to call it something that is makruh. So for instance, if I dislike people making dhikr in congregation in one voice, or I dislike people reading Quran in one voice, everyone's in a circle, reading Quran in one voice. If I dislike that, I'm not going to reach it to the level of haram. That would be a contradiction in your principles. Won't be able to work. But I may say it makruh. Makruh because the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have explicitly done that. Maybe the Sahaba are reported to explicitly have done that. And I might discuss other different mafasid of doing such a thing. Yeah? Like reading in a word, boys, you're causing a distraction now. What's your name? What's your name? Hamza. Hamza, are you going to distract the rest of us for the next 20 minutes, or are you going to focus? You sure? Is that a promise between me and you? Jazakallah khair. Or if you, boys, if you are distracted or you're tired listening, that's not a problem. I'll be tired listening as well. You can either go to the back, okay, and relax over there, and that's not a problem. I won't be upset if you leave the class. So where did we get to? We said that a bid'ah could be prohibited and it could be makruh, depending on how far it is from contradicting the sunnah, or how close it is to being, it seems like the sunnah has given it scope. Like someone who makes dhikr in jama'ah. We say that the sunnah has indicated towards dhikr and gatherings of dhikr. وَمَا اجْتَمَعَ قَوْمٌ فِي بَيْتٍ مِنْ بُيُوتِ اللَّهِ. Any group of people that come together in one of the houses of Allah, يَتْلُونَ كِتَابَ اللَّهِ, reciting the Quran. Are these not indications? They're indications. So even if I come to disagree with this thing, I'm not going to rule it to be haram. I'm going to say it is better to do it like this. Better to do it. Like some of the mashayikh, they said, I don't like people reciting Quran in one voice. Why? Because that means instead of reciting in a focused way, you're going to end up catching up with people. As you know, everyone has different breath. You've lost breath, but you can't read the full verse now because you need to catch up with the group, so you're missing a couple of words and then joining in. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, because you're catching up with them. So these are some of the potential problems of this type of thing. Like to say it's haram, it's a big statement. So therefore there's no problem in disagreeing with things and saying it's an innovation or it's something you should avoid, even in the act of worship. Like we have to know when to use terms like haram and terms like makruh. طيب. And like I said to you, this is explicit in the works of the Hanabi. Let me use some of the words of some of the quotes of the scholars rahimahullah. Al-Shafi'i says, إن البدعة المذمومة ما ليس لها أصل من الشريعة يرجع إليه. The disliked innovation is that which doesn't have an asl, a reference point in the Sharia, which it goes back to. Yeah? يرجع إليه. And he says, وهي البدعة في إطلاق الشرع. وأما البدعة المحمودة, as for the recommended bid'ah, so even here we have the term recommended bid'ah, as early as the Shafi'i. فأما البدعة المحمودة فما وافق السنة. It's that which is consistent with the sunnah. Why does the Shafi'i say this type of thing? Because when the Prophet ﷺ says to Bilal, I heard your footsteps in Jannah, and the hadith is in the Sahihain. I heard your footsteps in Jannah. What is it that made you reach paradise? He said, I don't know, except that every time I lose my wudu, and I make wudu, I pray 2 rak'ahs. The Prophet ﷺ didn't teach him this. The Prophet ﷺ didn't teach him this. He did it from his own self. And he was praised for that action. But if somebody says, but the Prophet approved it, we say, no. The Prophet didn't even tell him. How can he have approved it? He did it before he even told him. When one of the companions reads Surah Al-Ikhlas in every rak'ah, he reads a surah and a Surah Al-Ikhlas, surah and a Surah Al-Ikhlas. Some of the companions said, what's this guy doing? So they took him to the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, إِنَّهَا صِفَةُ الرَّحْمَنِ. It has the attribute of Ar-Rahman. So I like to recite with it. قال حبك إياها أدخلك الجنة. Your love of the attributes of Allah has entered you into Jannah. Even though he's doing something which could be called a bid'ah hasanah. Because the Prophet didn't teach him to do that. None of the companions knew this. In fact, they were annoyed at this. They were annoyed. And still he was praised for it. Do we say it's a sunnah to recite Surah Al-Ikhlas in every rak'ah? No. Not a sunnah. The Prophet didn't come to teach us that. But does it come under the scope of the sunnah? Does the sunnah give scope? Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah says this hadith proves that a person can read certain chapters of the Quran if he likes those chapters, even if he repeats them all the time. So when someone is reading Salah and they're constantly reading the same surah, sometimes because they've got bad hifz like me, so I have to read the same chapters. And sometimes because he likes this surah, I like this surah, so I want to keep reading. You say no problem. You say no problem, because it comes under the scope of the sunnah. So when some scholars say bid'ah hasanah, it is because they do not want to make these practices of the Sahaba innovations. So we say these practices, they're not a sunnah, but they come under the scope of the sunnah. Meaning the sunnah has given scope for them. One of the companions, when he stood up from ruku', he said, رَبَّنَا وَلَكَ الْحَمْدِ حَمْدًا كَثِيرًا طَيِّبًا مُبَارَكًا فِيهِ. Some of the scholars of hadith say this was at the beginning of Salah. And this is recommended to say as dua al-istiftah, some say in ruku', some say he sneezed, some say a whole load of long discussions that now isn't the place to go into. But the Prophet ﷺ praised him for doing it. And he told him that so and so angels were rushing to write this down. The Prophet ﷺ didn't teach him to do that. And it didn't become recommended after the Prophet ﷺ improved it. Otherwise that means the Prophet ﷺ was approving a bid'ah. Because he introduced it. The man introduced it. So the Prophet ﷺ approved this statement, and he approved the fact that he made the statement even though the Prophet ﷺ didn't teach him. Because he saw that it came under what the Sharia taught, what the Sunnah taught. Al-Khattabi rahimahullah, one of the early scholars of hadith also, he says, وَقَوْلُهُ كُلُّ مُحْدَثَةٍ بِدْعَةٍ. His statement, i.e. the Prophet ﷺ's statement, every innovation or every muhdatha, newly invented matter is an innovation. فَإِنَّ هَذَا خَاصٌ فِي بَعْضِ الْأُمُورِ دُونَ بَعْضٍ. This is specific to some things, not all things. وَكُلُّ شَيْءٍ أُحْدِثَ عَلَى غَيْرِ أَصْلٍ مِنْ أُصُولِ الدِّينِ وَعَلَى غَيْرِ عِيَالِهِ وَقِيَاسِهِ. Bid'ah, which is rebuked type of bid'ah, rejected bid'ah, is that which is innovated into the religion, which is not in accordance with the teachings of the religion. Not that it was reported word for word in a hadith, but it's not. What's the proof that he means this? He says, وَعَلَى غَيْرِ قِيَاسِهِ. It's not according to the qiyas of the sunnah. It's not according to the general teachings of the sunnah. This is a bid'ah. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ says in the hadith we quoted in the beginning, مَنْ أَحْدَثَ فِي أَمْرِنَا هَذَا مَا لَيْسَ مِنْهُ. What is not from it, فَهُوَ رَدٌّ. That indicates that it's possible to do something, ihdath, even though we don't want to use the word ihdath because it has negative connotations. But it indicates that there's a potential for doing something, وَهُوَ مِنْهُ, that's from the religion. Like what Bilal did, like what some of the Sahaba did, like what Ibn Umar did on a number of things, like what Uthman did when he introduced another adhan. And it's reported that Bukhari reports that Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu was the first person to introduce the second adhan on the khutbah, on the Friday khutbah. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, when the khatib comes in and sits down, the adhan is made. But when people became much larger in number, he made adhan at the time of dhuhr, beginning of dhuhr, zawal, and the second adhan when the khatib goes onto the minbar. Ibn Abdul Bar says, I do not know of any difference that Uthman was the first person to do this. That means it's not a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Is it an act of worship? طبعا, it's the adhan. So it comes into the discussion of bid'ah. And still Uthman did it. Still Uthman did it. Like, is it consistent with the qiyas of the sunnah? It is consistent with the qiyas of the sunnah. Because the sunnah is that the adhan is made for every salah at the beginning of the time. At the beginning of time. And Uthman simply made adhan at the beginning of time. Instead of delaying it when the khatib sits down. And he did it at the beginning and then afterwards also, because he didn't want to leave the adhan which the Prophet ﷺ used to do. So he simply added in an adhan consistent with all the other adhans. This distinction is important. Because as I said, otherwise we're going to end up saying this is bid'ah. And some people have said that. Making 2 adhans on Friday is a bid'ah. You can't say such a big statement about an action of Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu. And the Prophet ﷺ says, "Alaykum bi sunnati wa sunnati al-khulafa ar-rashidin." Take with my sunnah and the sunnah of the khulafa. طيب, we have other definitions of bid'ah. Tfadl.
You might cover it, but I was going to say is the scholars that came later, they used terms such as maslaha, maslaha mursala. Is that what is referred to?
With Uthman's action.
Yeah, so what the earlier scholars mentioned, like Imam Shaykh called it Hasan al-Mahmuda. Scholars that came after in the sort, they mentioned maslaha mursala.
Abadan. Because maslaha mursala, طبعا, sometimes there can be a bit of an overlap between maslaha mursala and between bid'ah hasana, if you want to use that term. And the overlap is that it relates to some part of the religion. Lakin, do we say it's used as a means, or do we say it's part of the worship? Like using a subha. Some scholars say it's a bid'ah. Very few scholars say it's a bid'ah. Only some of the contemporary scholars. And maybe 1 or 2 of the previous scholars. Like the Salaf, generally speaking, are on the permissibility of using a subha. Yeah, a dhikr bead. Do we say this is something that comes under bid'ah, or do we say it's maslaha because it's only used as a means for counting how much dhikr a person makes and so on? Sometimes there can be an overlap between maslaha mursala and between. Like some things are clearly not maslaha mursala. Bilal prays 2 rak'ahs after making wudu every single time. That can't be maslaha mursala. That's clearly part of ibadah.
So, that isn't the approvers that you've mentioned about Bilal radiallahu anhu, are they not part of the definition of what sunnah is? The approvals of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam?
He definitely approved it, but why is that different from someone saying, I pray 2 rak'ahs after every dars?
Why is it different?
Or would you say it's the same?
No, I wouldn't say it's the same.
Why?
Because we know the Prophet approved that.
No. Like, when did he approve it?
After Bilal.
That's the point.
Yeah.
And the issue here is the Prophet approved something before he taught it. The Prophet's job is to teach people what's correct and what's incorrect. If Bilal did something without the Prophet's permission, as the scholars of Usul say, لا يجوز تأخير البيان عن وقت الحاجة. It is not permissible to delay bayan from the time of hajj, the time of need. If it was wrong of Bilal radiallahu anhu to do this without the Prophet's permission, he would have said to him, زادك الله حرصا ولا تعود, like he said to the other companion when he made ruku' behind the saf and walked to the saf whilst in ruku'. قال زادك الله حرصا ولا تعود. May Allah increase you in concern, but don't do that again. He would have said to Bilal, do this, no problem, pray 2 rak'ahs after. But next time, only stick to what I have taught you. تركتكم على البيضاء. But he didn't say that to him. He approved the practice and he approved Bilal's method. That's the point here. Some people argue, no, this was approved. We say the Prophet approved his method. He approved the fact that he did it without permission. That's the point. Because Bilal understood the Prophet taught us to pray 2 rak'ahs at any time.
But also, in addition, specifically after wudu, it was also taught. It was just the fact that he made it something consistent every time he made wudu, he would pray to.
Where was it taught?
من توضأ فأحسن وضوءه.
نعم صحيح. لا ليس في السنة. It's in the صحيحين. نعم. But the point is he makes it consistent. he makes it consistent, and he makes it to sunnah even for himself.
Yes, so it's like he's doing
Increased ibadah.
Yes.
That's an example. What do you say about the example of the companion who recites the same surah after during every rak'ah? That's the point. These are examples. طبعا there's no doubt it can be a back and forth for some of these issues. There's no issue. It's a valid point that Bilal is doing something that is consistent, similar to Umar's practice when he says ni'matul bid'ah. This is a recommended bid'ah, even though the Prophet did tarawih already. So it's almost like he's only continuing the sunnah. Bilal is doing a similar thing, but making it consistent. But making dhikr, reciting certain surah specifically after every time. The point is, the Prophet ﷺ wasn't critical because these things were consistent with the general usul, even if something specific wasn't taught. This is the background of some scholars who allow or are more flexible with acts of worship, even if they're not explicitly reported. We have a lot of other definitions, and there's a lot to continue talking about. Imam Ahmad rahimahullah, in an important statement of his, he says, al-ittiba', following the sunnah. أن يتبع رجل ما جاء عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وعن أصحابه. So Ahmad made following the Sahaba sunnah, or he made it something that's part of guidance. That's important. He says afterwards, taking with what the tabi'een say, هو فيه مخير. He has the choice to take with the different opinions of the tabi'een if he wishes or not. And then he also talks about following the tabi'een and says, rarely will you find the fatwa from the tabi'een, the scholars of the tabi'een, except that it has an asl in the Sahaba. Anyways, we need to summarize. There's a lot to say. When we say that the issue of contradicting the sunnah is what counts as a bid'ah, despite that, even that, we say the more you keep away from anything that's not reported, the better. Why? Because the line between what is within the bounds of the sunnah and what's not can sometimes be blurred. For example, Ka'b ibn Ujra radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, he saw a khatib giving the khutbah sitting down, and he criticized him harshly. He was an amir, he was a leader, and he criticized him for giving the khutbah sitting down. This is something that somebody could argue, there's no problem. The Prophet didn't prohibit it. But still he criticized. Some of the khulafa decided to give the khutbah of Eid before Salah. Even though the sunnah is to pray, then give the khutbah. He said, because people do what they do today, and that's leave after Salah. He said, I don't want them to leave, so I want to do the khutbah before Salah, and then afterwards the Salah. So some of the Sahaba said to him, Salah first. Then he explained, and said to him, people leave and things like that. And he criticized him. He said, you're more guided. The Prophet ﷺ used to do this. Salah, then the khutbah. Is it possible for someone to use an argument and say, but we want people to listen to the khutbah? It's possible. Like, where do you draw the line? The Sahaba still criticized them. And this is why I said earlier, if someone said to you, you can celebrate Christmas, because we're celebrating the Prophet. If your principle is allowing innovations that are hasan, then you're going to end up causing yourself a lot of problems. This is why we go back to the principle that we mentioned. The issue of bid'ah requires a lot of research on a lot of issues. If a scholar allows something or does something, that gives us a reason to give someone an excuse. However, the door of bid'ah, the more we close it, the better. Because once it's opened, it gives an excuse to do more, then more, and we end up with all sorts of chaos which are unknown to the religion. And drawing the line between bid'ah hasana and bid'ah sayyah can sometimes be difficult. Anyway, so hopefully some of these principles are some useful principles. The key principles that we mentioned is that things need research before we embark on being so tough with them. We have to research. We have to distinguish between major innovations and innovations where there is potential scope. When a scholar allows something or people are following reliable scholars, we should use that as a reason to give them excuses. Khalas, okay, you're following a trustworthy scholar, I'll leave that to you. That's up to you. I have my view, and I might want to try and convince you of my view, no problem, but I leave you to that because you're doing something that is acceptable in Islam, in that you are following a scholar. Having said that, because the door of innovation is one that could potentially open up and become a problematic one, the more someone closes it, the better. And as Ahmad rahimahullah used to say, إِيَّاكَ أَن تَفْعَلَ شَيْءٍ لَيْسَ لَكَ فِيهِ إِيمَانٍ. Be careful of doing anything except you have an iman, a predecessor from the Prophet ﷺ or the Sahaba or Tabi'in. طيب, you had a point?
You mentioned it, just to make reiteration of the fact that ibadah
is the place of discussion.
And it shouldn't be
Brother,
that
please
someone...
let allow you.
He's saying that ibadah is tawqifi, meaning that ibadah is something that you can't add to it. You can't do ibadah except through what the Prophet ﷺ taught. The problem is we'd have all these examples that we mentioned, can't come into that qa'idah, which shows that ibadah is tawqifi as an asl. And this further strengthens the point of keeping to what is narrated. Keeping to what's narrated and not avoiding adding anything in. Lakin, it's not sufficient as a qa'idah on its own. Because ibadah being tawqifi, sometimes the sunnah itself gives scope. Yani the sunnah, when it comes to dhikr, gives scope. So if you want to make dhikr 100 times, that's up to you. 1,000 times, that's up to you. In the morning, during the day, in the night, that's up to you. The sunnah gives scope for prayers. So you want to pray at this time, or that time, or afterwards, or before, or then, that's up to you. The sunnah gives scope for dua. So you want to make dua after the dars, scope. So the ibadah is tawqifi. Like sometimes the nature of the ibadah itself is that it has given scope. It hasn't restricted. And so, yeah, that's the... Tfaddal, Ibrahim. Qasim, sorry. Ibrahim, Qasim. If the Quran accident drops, is it recommended to kiss it? I don't say it's recommended necessarily because the Prophet ﷺ, and to make something recommended needs to be established. But is it permissible? Yes. And Ikrimah used to kiss the mushaf and do so. So a lot of people, when they drop the mushaf, out of respect they want to kiss the mushaf or maybe wipe it and put it on a high place. We say Jazakallah khair, وَمَن يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِن تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. Yeah.
So does that come from doing qiyas on the sunnah? So they like some of them when it comes to the what's it called, the salat of Khayr they say salat there's no way that actually comes.
They say what? Na'am, sadaqta wa barit. Na'am.
Other things like this where it's like they know something said somewhere else but nothing said here, so they saw it's like a
Sahih, almost. And this goes back to the issue of qiyas in ibadah. طبعا a lot of scholars say there's no qiyas in ibadah. But that as a general statement requires more tahreem. Because some types of qiyas in ibadah are permitted. This is why the Hanabila, for example, they say it is recommended or wajib to say Bismillah before making ghusl. The Prophet ﷺ didn't even discuss that issue. طبعا the issue of saying Bismillah before wudu is a point of discussion in the first place. Like, and they say because it's recommended before wudu, it's recommended before ghusl. That's a type of qiyas, but it's qiyas shabah. It's not a qiyas ilm necessarily, because ibadat are not really said to have that type of ilm. Same with your example of saying sadaqta wa barit when the mu'adhin says as-salatu khayrun min an-nawm. They said you can't repeat it because it's not a dhikr. Salatu khayrun min an-nawm. Yeah, salatu khayrun min an-nawm is not a dhikr. It's a statement. So they say, when you're saying something for the other statements, you should also say something here. But you can't repeat it because it's not a dhikr. So therefore they recommended this type of statement. Taban, it shouldn't be called a sunnah. Even then, it shouldn't be called a sunnah. But some of the fuqaha, like the Hanabila, they say yustahab, yusannu, or it's recommended to say this type of thing because of the appropriate nature. And so on. Jazakum tayyib. Sisters, do we have anything? sisters always neglected. But at the same time, they never speak either, so... Jazakumullah khair. طيب, تفضل.
You mentioned before that there might be actions from the Sahaba or Tabi'in that might be permissible, but not necessarily can be referred to as Sunnah. Now, obviously, it's widely known that Umar al-Khattab was the one who increased the number of rakats of Taraweeh to 20 and also to 36. So you can see in the books of the Fuqaha that they mention 20 as being Sunnah, as in Tusannu, 20 rakat. So how do they call 20 a Sunnah? That's not from
The problem of the question is, how could something be called a Sunnah even though it's not explicitly from the Prophet ﷺ? Really, the Fuqaha radiallahu anhum, they were flexible in using recommended, the word recommended interchangeably. So they would say yusannu, or yustahabbu, or yundabu, or yahsunu. These types of statements, they use them interchangeably. So you will find them using yusannu for things that are not reported from the Prophet ﷺ. Taban, this is an usuli discussion which is potentially problematic. Because then we're not distinguishing between what's from the Prophet ﷺ and what's from afterwards, and what's based on qiyas and what's based on this and that. And this is why some scholars have disliked that. And they said you don't use the word sunnah except for established sunnah, and other things you say mandub, or you say mustahab, recommended. So when they say yusannu, they mean it is recommended. They don't mean necessarily that this is established authentically from the Prophet ﷺ. And they use that a lot of the times quite loosely. So when you find this, the fuqaha saying, yusannu kada, it's recommended to do kada, don't assume that the Prophet ﷺ did that automatically. It could be from the Sahaba, it could be from the Tabi'een, it could be a qiyas based on some of the sunnah.
Also, it's important to know that the bid'ah, as some scholars said, has no basis or nothing to fall back on in the deen. That's why it's called bid'ah. Because some people, they rush and they go, for example, once some brothers, they were having a discussion with one of the scholars, and they said about reading the Quran Jama'ah as a bid'ah. And he stopped them there. He said, wait, why are we rushing and call it bid'ah straight away? He said, bid'ah has no basis in the deen. And these people, therefore, on the back of the hadith, the Prophet and it was directed in plural, that hadith. So they have a basis, and you can't just call it bid'ah. And that's what happened with lots of, people that rush and call things bid'ah. And I heard someone about even like starting, there was a lecture, and they had someone reading Quran before the lecture, and one of the people asked, the bid'ah.
That's the proof.
So the Shaykh said, did the Prophet appoint someone to come and give a lecture He said, well, you come in now to this lecture, really is a bid'ah, because the Sahaba didn't appoint someone and they came. So, just jump and start calling things bid'ah.
And really, there's a lot that I've prepared to discuss which I haven't been able to discuss. But I want people to go away with this principle. That which clashes with the Sunnah, meaning it contradicts it, is an innovation, with no khilaf. And that which comes under the general permissibility, or like Shaykh Saad said it, this practice has something to fall back on. As Ibn Rajab rahimahullah says, لا يوجد له أصل يرجع إليه. There's no asl that it returns back to. It has a reference. There's something it can go back to. If there's something that someone can fall back on in the deen, that's where we say, okay, that's something where either we excuse it, or I say, I believe it's incorrect, but I accept your ijtihad on this issue. And that's the main sort of thing that we hopefully take away from today. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. And as we said, the more a person sticks to the clear sunnah, and the sunnah that are clear, the better for them. Barakallahu feekum, and I apologize for going slightly over time.